Ah, ok, adesso devo...
Ok, adesso dovrebbe essere partita la registrazione.
Sì.
Everybody to the end of your data. The speaker today, Lorenzo Bardone from SISSA, and we talk about how neural networks structure the data. Please.
Thanks, Matteo. So I will present what I've been doing these almost 4 years under the supervision of Professor Sebastian Gold. So my research is on the theory of neural networks, and particularly on structural data. And I will present some topics about algorithmic hardness, independent components, and neural network dynamics. But first, I want to give some motivation on why we study. Okay, it's working. Why we study the topics that we present. So first, let's think about what neural networks learn from data, because this is already a non-trivial question. So let's take one of the first neural networks that came to prominence because they managed to beat humanly made programs. So before neural networks, humans put their knowledge inside the program. And instead, this network learned from scratch how to classify images and managed to beat the expert programs. In 2012, this was a huge success, but it's not clear how a deep convolutional neural network manages to classify images. And so one thing you can do is to take the first layer of filters, that the weights that the network learns, and plot them, and at least look at what this neural network was learning. People were very excited when they saw this picture of the filters, because there are some of these filters, okay, there are some red squares here, and you see that in all these red squares, there are some, like, the image is blurry, and then there is a region in which you can see some stripes. People were incredibly excited about seeing these things, because these things have a name. They are called Gabor filters. Here we have a 3D plot of this. They are very simple mathematically. You can just multiply a Gaussian kernel times a sinusoidal function. The Gaussian will create a concentration in one region, and the sinusoidal will create the stripe. And they're very important because people already knew these are good filters for signal processing. And also there are theories that find these structures also in the human brain, in the visual cortex. So, and this was not only for this network. This is a modern network on a different architecture, and you still see the patterns. And also, not even a convolutional network, but just a simple multi-layer perceptron, and you can still see these Gabor filters here. So it really looks like it's not something that depends on the architecture or on the way you train it. It's really something that depends on the data that you're trying to learn, and some properties inside the data are implying that you will learn such filters. So what we try to do is to understand, analyze the statistical properties of data, and try to understand how this filter structure depends on the statistical properties of data. So now I have to take some steps back and introduce some notation that we focus on statistical properties and the so-called higher order correlations. So if you take any probability measure, you can study the statistical properties that define the properties of the measure. And important properties are the cumulants, and you can find them by taking the moment generating function, which is the expectation of e to the psi x. This is the expectation over x. And then take the log and expand. You will have a series of terms in which each the order k term will be an order k tensor that encode the order k like correlations inside your distributions. The first few are very famous because the first is the mean vector, so mu is the mean of the distribution, sigma is the covariance matrix of the distributions, and then the later ones are much less famous. This is the skewness, the order 4 is the kurtosis, but they're way less famous. This is because the first two are the ones that univocally identify a Gaussian. So if you have present the formula of the density of a Gaussian, you just specify the mean, you specify the covariance matrix, and then you have defined it. And Gaussians are, of course, very important for central limit theorem. So basically, most of things you can model with a Gaussian. But even things that are maybe very complex, you can still model with a Gaussian just by taking the mean and the covariance matrix. You will take a distribution with that mean and that covariance, and you will have your Gaussian approximation. But you will lose a lot. You will lose all these terms, so all the higher order correlations. And sometimes it's okay to do this, it's okay to lose them, but our argument is that to understand feature learning of deep networks, you cannot lose the higher order correlations. On the opposite, higher order correlations are really, really important. To see this, let's do an experiment. So these are convolutional networks similar as the one I showed before. And you can train on ImageNet. This is just to show that they are learning. So these are steps that you make during training. And this is the accuracy that at some point goes up. Here instead, we measure the non-Gaussianity of the post-activation, which means that you take your network, you take the first layer, you dot it with the input, and you measure the kurtosis of this lambda. So this is the fourth order cumulant of the post-activation. And you see, it starts to go up as soon as you learn. So basically, it's not even clear if you learn because this is going up, or okay, it's clear that they are very related phenomena. And you can also see it from the filters that you learn. So at the beginning, they are very, very isotropic. As soon as you hit the moment in which you start learning and you start learning your filters, bam, you can see the Gaussian, the Gabor filter. Gabor filters here and here. And then the filters won't even change so much. They will be a little bit more defined at the final of the training. But already after 10,000 steps, you could see basically all the shapes of the filters. So this was to motivate that there is really evidence to think that the feature that deep networks extract are related to the higher order properties of probability distributions. And so now we want to take a more theoretical approach and understand in general how hard it is to learn from these higher order correlations. So let's take the simplest possible model in which we can study this phenomenon so that we can do all the math rigorously, which is an hypothesis testing problem. So we take hypothesis testing means that you will receive a bunch of samples either from distribution Q or either from distribution P. And you will have to use those samples to understand which of the two distributions we're coming from. Distribution Q is the simplest possible, it's just a Gaussian in the dimensions. Distribution P is still the Gaussian noise, but then we are adding a term. This is a non-Gaussian term. V is just a vector that's saying the direction. And G is a scalar non-Gaussian variable that will introduce the non-Gaussianity. And then we have to do apply a whitening operation, because if we add to a Gaussian an independent variable, it will also change the variance along that direction. And it means that if you do a Gaussian approximation, you will still find it. But instead, we want a task that you can distinguish only by looking at higher order correlations. So we apply this whitening that shifts back so that the variance along that direction is 1. So to show a plot. So our data set, if we look in any random direction, you will just see the black line. You will just see a standard Gaussian. If you pick the right direction V, which is the direction of the spike, you will see this bimodal distribution. But the mean is 0. The variance is 1. So you will, to understand that this is not a Gaussian, you will really understand the higher order properties, this bimodality of the distribution. Okay, now what we do is to study the problem in high dimensional limit. Because in classical statistics, usually the dimension is fixed, so D is fixed, and N goes to infinity. But then it's a trivial problem because you will distinguish any two distributions with N going to infinity. In modern machine learning regimes, you never have so many more samples than dimensions because the dimension is the number of parameters that you have, and the number of parameters is crazy. Like in modern large language models, it's billions. So it's much more accurate to model them as both going to infinity with some scaling. And the scaling will be the critical parameter. So this theta, so we take n going to infinity as d to the theta, and theta becomes the key parameter. We want to find the smallest theta such that we can distinguish these two distributions. Okay, this will plus a bibliographical note on who others studied this problem before. Okay, the approach that we use is the likelihood function approach, which is the way statisticians call the Radon-Nikodym derivative. So L is the Radon-Nikodym derivative of the distribution P with respect to the distribution Q. And it's clear this is a quantity that encodes a lot of properties of the problem, because distinguishing the two distributions means finding a sequence of events that probability with respect to P goes to 1. Probability with respect to Q goes to 0. This means that you distinguish the two. But what does the likelihood ratio if you find such events? It means that it needs to be the integral over Q of this likelihood ratio. If you take that event, needs to be as probability 0 along Q, but needs to be very large on L. So basically, it means that the L2 norm of L must diverge. So this is a single test that we will use. We will compute L in our case, and we will make asymptotics and try to understand which is the critical exponent. But this is not a complete picture, because this only tells if there is a way to distinguish the two distributions. It tells nothing about how hard it is to distinguish the two. Because maybe there is an algorithm that runs in exponential time. For example, if you try every possible solution of this for the spike and you do an exhaustive search, then maybe you will find it, but it will be very inefficient. So we care about polynomial distinguishability, like distinguishability in polynomial time. To study it, we apply the method of low-degree polynomials, which is basically projecting down this likelihood ratio on the space of polynomials of degree up to d. This is a projection that's done with using the structure of the Hilbert space that's provided by the measure Q. So basically, we use Hermite polynomials since they are an orthonormal basis for this kind of L2 product. And then this is basically the best polynomial test. And so if the best polynomial test for all degree D, capital D, doesn't work, then we can say that there is no polynomial test that doesn't work. And then here there is a big gap. There is this conjecture that for me always looks pretty strange. If there is no polynomial algorithm, if there is no polynomial that distinguishes, then there is no polynomial time algorithm that distinguishes the two distributions. Just kind of way a big gap. Like polynomials are just very simple functions. Polynomial time algorithm are like you can do whatever. Basically, it just means to be polynomial. But indeed, like this conjecture has been verified in many problems or in a certain class, and under very reasonable hypothesis, nobody is able to find a counterexample. So at the moment, we believe in this conjecture. Let's see what happens. So this is what we find for the statistical threshold. We computed the likelihood ratio, and we said it diverges as soon as theta approaches 1, which means that the problem is easy, because at linear sample complexity, you have as many samples as dimensions. It's clear that you cannot have less samples than dimensions, because then you cannot even like inspect all the space. But as soon as you have as many samples as dimension, then you can solve it. But the surprise comes looking at the low-degree polynomials. This was a bit more complicated. We cannot compute it precisely. We had to do a lower bound and upper bound. But if you do the asymptotics, you find that this low degree likelihood ratio will be 1 if theta is smaller than 2, and it will diverge as soon as theta is larger than 2. So this means that, okay, of course they are different. So here we have a linear central complexity, here we have a quadratic central complexity. It means that there is a statistical to computational gap. So if you have unbounded computational power, you will just need a linear amount of samples. If instead you want to be efficiently computationally, you will have a big gap. You will not need a linear samples, not even a bit more, you will need way more samples. This is also surprising because it doesn't happen for low order correlations. So if at the beginning of the model, I didn't whiten, so I didn't reduce the information in the variance, then linear samples are sufficient also for computationally fast. You have a quadratic algorithm that solves. So this is kind of the theoretical baseline of learning from high order humans. We already saw there is a surprise, but this is just theory. There are no neural networks up to this point. So now the question is, but not now, can we analyze how neural networks perform on this kind of data sets? The problem is that it's very challenging because deep neural networks are super, super complicated. Even to just write the gradients to train them, it's like super crazy formulas. So we need to find a model that somehow captures how neural network learn, but it's not too complex that we cannot analyze. So let's go back to the features that neural networks were finding. So as you see, these are Gabor filters because they are localized and there are stripes. Except that these are not filters found by networks. These are filters that another algorithm finds. Okay, yes. An algorithm called independent component analysis is finding the same filters. And with Fabiola, we investigated this algorithm because an algorithm that's finding the same features of the deep convolutional networks can shed light on how deep convolutional network can learn. And luckily, it is a very simple problem. So ICA, independent component analysis, has this very basic setup. You have data, so n data points in the dimension as before, and you just want to optimize this function, where W is your parameter you're optimizing over, X are the data points you're taking the expectations. So everything is encoded in G. You have to take G such that it's a measure of non-Gaussianity. There are a lot of hypotheses on which G you can take, but for simplicity, most of people consider these two different options. So either a kernel or a log cosh, but it's not important. Let's keep G general. G is a function with some properties. And we ask, okay, we want to optimize this. What's the minimal number of samples such that we can optimize it? So the data is, as before, the spite cumulant model. And to optimize ICA, we run an algorithm that's called fast ICA. Because in practice, that's what people use, and that's what people consider fast in low dimensions. Now we want to study this algorithm in high dimensions. I won't enter into details on the algorithm. It's just a fixed point iterating algorithm of second order. It's kind of not particularly exciting. And then we study the overlap. So this is our guess for a solution. And V is actually the spike that it's inside the system. And so we want to study alpha. If alpha is large, it means we found the solution. If alpha is small, it means we are still not finding it. And at the beginning of the training, since W is random, alpha will be 0. We'll scale with 1 over square root of D. Okay, so let's see what happens. So here we take a scaling. So on the x-axis, there are the steps. But at each step, we are using d-squared samples, which is the optimal that we know from theory. Like we cannot do better than that because this is a polynomial algorithm. And we know, and we see that it's not learning. The overlap stays low. Then if we take way more samples, this is d to the cube. then we see that it's kind of learning, but there are very, very wide error bars. So it's one of these cases in which simulations don't really tell you, because we have to run this on a finite dimension, but we want to know what happens in the infinite limit. So this is kind of a blurry case. And then this is the case that, okay, we can confidently say that if we have like d to the fourth samples, then we're learning for sure. And in 2 steps, we reach 1 overlap. And it's also possible to analyze it concretely mathematically. And indeed, what happens is that, as we expect, if your exponent theta is less than 3, so in this case, and almost in this case, this is a little bit more than 3, the overlap is really of order 1 over d, 1 over square root of d. So it's very low. And then it also clarifies this case, because if theta is between 3 and 4, so exactly this case, we also know that we don't learn. It will not go to 0 as fast, but still it will go to 0, and we don't learn. And the only case in which we learn is exactly this case, in which we have at least a power 4 of samples. So this is the description of fast ICA, but basically the bottom line is exactly this. So fast ICA is very slow in high dimensions, and you need a lot of samples, and basically you shouldn't use it. But let's see, and okay, the proof is basically following the idea from this papers. But let's see if we can speed it up a bit. Yes.
So the simple complexity of the SCA is computed theoretically.
Okay, so you mean, so this sample complexity were computed theoretically in this specific case. So 1 step fast ICA, but this is, I mean, to compute a sample complexity, you really need to specify a goal and also a protocol that you optimize over. You were asking whether, in general, this problem, if this problem is known.
So because for me, sample complexity is the minimum number of samples you need so that there exists an algorithm.
Yes. Okay. So
that
this is
independent. The algorithm.
Okay. This is yeah. This is what we did before, because exactly. Okay, exactly. So this function is not the same as what we were discussing before, but it's very related. So in general, like if you don't constrain to any algorithm, then it should be discrete.
You expect more or less.
Yeah, no, it's basically 1-to-1. Like the fact that you have this g function, like it could depend a bit on the different functions, but only the constants, not the power of convergence. So it's discrete.
What is G?
G, exactly. So it's basically the function that defines the algorithm, but keep in mind that G is one of these 2. It holds also for other functions. So it's either e to the minus s squared over 2 or a log cosh. It could also be a 4th degree Hermite polynomial. So there are some choices that you can make. The important thing is that it's a function that finds non-Gaussianities in the data. So yes.
Why log cosh?
Something because log cosh, the properties of these functions that are important is when you expand in a Hermite polynomial basis, you will see the coefficients, and they need to have the first few coefficients to be 0, and then positive coefficients. So it's kind of, and like it's kind of, this satisfies, and it's also bounded and nice, and so they took it. But it's yeah, it's basically a
the first coefficients are 0.
Expansion of
yes. Even functions have all the odd coefficients to be 0, so already even functions are nice. Yeah, but it's practitioners that found these functions. For us, the most convenient one would have been Hermite 4, because it's in expansion, it has all the coefficients to be 0 except 1. But practitioners don't use it so much, so we kept that.
So where are you using W star?
So W star is the goal. We want to find W star.
Okay.
Exactly. And basically, this algorithm should find it, but we see that all the averages that we have here, so they should be like correct averages, but instead you have always a finite number of samples, so they will be approximated averages. Okay. And in the study way that we do, we say, if you have these approximated averages that are with too few samples, you will not converge to W star.
And TD is it for every iteration or every layer?
No, there is no neural network now. Or the neural network is just one neuron. It's just W. So this is just a single neuron, and we are learning it.
So this signify
T is the training time. So at each step, you train, like you execute this algorithm, and you expect in like 5 steps to reach the solution. Something like that. Okay. Other question? Okay. So this is the theorem, and we expect to be able to speed it up. So let's go to SGD, stochastic gradient descent, which I realized I didn't put the formula, but it's basically the standard algorithm with which you optimize neural networks. It's the go-to, and indeed, even the most simple version of SGD, it's already an improvement. Instead of getting d to the 4th, you get d to the cube. So already this very stupid algorithm, but that's optimized for large dimensions, works better than the optimized algorithm, but for low dimensions. But it's possible to improve it even more. So this is a trick that appeared in this paper from 2023. If you smooth the loss, so basically instead of using the loss that I showed before, just an expectation of G, you apply this operator that depends on lambda, which basically introduces another variable that's distributed uniformly on the sphere centered in W. No, it's not centered in 0, but because W is already here. But anyways, you basically, instead of just seeing your loss in just one point, you also look around. Because maybe like when you have to compute a function just in W, in that point specifically was not good, but if you move around a bit, you find points that are better. And so this algorithm just looks a bit around to try to find a little bit more of information. And indeed, if you plot the loss as a function of your overlap, you will see that if you don't apply smoothing, at 0 you're very flat. So you have to think that you start from 0, and here if you compute the gradient, it's basically 0. So you don't see where you have to go. But if you apply smoothing, you can reach, okay, it will be much more noisy, but it will be way steeper. So if you start from 0 here, your gradient will increase way better. And this is why we managed to improve the sample complexity. Okay, so the linear case is still 0, but this is what we expect because this is a polynomial time algorithm. So at linear time, you should learn. Here instead, we have a quadratic number of samples, and we see that the smooth version learns, and the other one doesn't learn. So the vanilla one doesn't learn. And then a cubic sample complexity, the smooth one goes to 1 super fast, and the other one learns. So this is exactly what we expect. I mean, this means that this is scaling upwards. So okay, it works. And not only that, but it's possible also to prove it. So this is the math version of it. It's kind of a bit technical, so I will skip the details. But under suitable hypotheses over G and over your distribution of the data, it's possible to prove that you will learn exactly at quadratic sample complexity.
This is counterintuitive. If the sample complexity is less, then the neural network should learn very nicely. So, but what you're showing is that as you go up with the sample complexity, your learning is better. This is what you're showing, right?
Yes. So maybe I didn't define what I mean by sample complexity is you have more samples.
Okay.
So that's what you expect.
Okay. I see.
Okay. Maybe I was not clear.
Because now I understand.
Okay. So if you have more samples, of course, usually you learn more, you learn faster. And reaching quadratic means that you reach the optimum, because before we showed that you cannot do better than quadratic with polynomial time algorithm. Okay, so this is done, but as you were mentioning, there is no neural network here. We were at just one neuron. We were doing a toy task, and also the data was not like a model that we defined in a simple way, but it's not the real data. So let's go back to real data. Let's go back to ImageNet, which were the images that I showed at the beginning. So our data made up of realistic images. And let's try ICA real data. At linear sample complexity, it doesn't learn. And you can see that we can try patches of images that are larger and larger. And the larger the patch, the higher is the line. Well, we would like to go low. We would like to reach the minimum of the loss. So basically, we are not learning here at all, which is what we expect. So even if I showed that at linear sample complexity, we couldn't learn only for the theoretical data. But this is also a confirmation that also for real world data, we don't learn. And it's possible instead to speed it up only if you do a trick of projecting over PCA components. So this is a very common algorithm in data processing. You get your data and you just take the direction that maximizes the variance of your data, which should be the most significant, and you project down on those and keep only those and forget about everything else. The kind of surprise here is that we keep just a fixed number of principal components. So we are in a number of dimensions that's going to infinity. Usually people keep at least a fraction, you keep 1/10 of the dimensions, like some kind of things that doesn't go to zero. Instead here we keep 30 and everything else we throw away, and it's still better than running the algorithm on everything. Here we find these lines that go down, looking just at 30 dimensions over thousands. So this is nice that, these data processing algorithms can speed up, but also the problem is that neural network, we don't give neural networks the process data, we give them the raw data. But still they are able to learn it very fast. So this is the plot that I showed before, and after 1,000 steps, they already solved it. And they already found the non-Gaussian components. So it means that somehow, the idea that we got is that neural networks are implicitly able to process the data, to pre-process the data before learning AI over accumulants without having you to do it. And mostly that in the data, there is already something that allows to learn higher order correlations starting from some low order correlations. So we made this experiment of running the same network as before. And the blue line here is the same that we have here. So we just plot the excess kurtosis. And the green line here is the overlap with the principal component subspace. So basically, your network will learn at the beginning, and the first layer weights, we see how much they overlap with the ones that we get running PCA. And we see that the green line goes up either at the same time or before the blue line, which can give the indication that you exploit the low order information that you get from PCA to learn the higher order information. So we should find a way to test this and to understand if there is a theoretical model to do it. And okay, this will be the last. Oh, okay, but it's early. Okay, but still, this is the last model I will show. It's a variant of the model that I showed before, in which we had V, and so V is the non-Gaussian spike, H is the non-Gaussian direction. But here we also add other two directions, which we call the easy ones, so the low order correlations. This changes the mean, and this is just a Gaussian spike, so G is a Gaussian, so that it will change the covariance along one direction. But this should be easy, and the red one should be hard. And it's still a hypothesis testing / classification task. So we give to a network samples either from the two, and it should distinguish which one goes. So we have two spikes, the latent variables are non-Gaussian and Gaussian. Okay, and then what do we do? So we train a two-layer neural network on the whole task. So either this or this, and then the network is trained for a long time. But in the meantime, we test it on clones of the actual full distributions. So for example, this blue line is testing on a clone that has only this blue spike. The green line is testing on a clone that has the first two, but not the third. And then the red line is testing on everything. So what happens as training goes on, and this means also as you accumulate more and more samples, at the beginning they're all overlapped. Then at some point, the blue and the other lines depart. This means that here, like the network is learning something more instead of only the mean of your data. And so if you test only on the mean clones, you will lose performance and you will improve on the other ones. So this means we are accessing the information that's inside the covariates. And then the green and the red lines stay overlapped for so long. So this is in log scale. So after 100,000 sample steps to 10 million steps, they will perform exactly the same. And after 10 million steps, they will diverge, which means that we are learning finally the last part.
You understand how the data set is generated?
Yeah, that's very important. So it's still a classification. So basically, with probability 1/2, you generate either just noise or this. This is labeled -1, this is labeled +1, and you give to the network. So it's a supervised learning. So the network will learn that it has to say 1 if it finds one of the spikes. It has to say 0 if it doesn't find anything. It has to say -1 if it doesn't find anything. Okay, on the full distribution. But then we test on clones that only have either this or all the three.
Okay.
Okay.
You're able to understand if network is
Exactly. So because the network is learning, but basing on what features of the distribution it's learning.
But this is empirical testing. Is there a theoretical guarantee that
I will come to that in a second. Yes, this is just empirical, of course. So let's finish with the empirical plots, because this is basically a confirmation of the theory that we had, that learning from higher order cumulants is difficult, but it's not it's in opposition to what we see in practice. The neural network is fast even from higher order cumulants. But then the model is instead of also considering a flux of information between the easy spikes, the easy part of the data, to the hard part of the data. So in this case, instead of taking G and H independent, we can take them to be correlated. So H is the sign of G. So in two orthogonal directions that could have nothing to do with each other, but they will be synchronized. So if you already found U, one expects to more easily find this hidden correlation inside B. And this is what happens. So as you can see, here we have this plateau, and here instead we have some kind of slide. And you will depart, the red line departs from the green line at 10,000 steps, 10,000 samples. So from 10 millions, you reach to 10,000. This is a very good gain. But this, of course, was just experiments, and we want to see the...
Sorry, one question.
Yes. Yes.
This is okay. This is a nice model. So I want to relate this to some real world. So for example, if I want to replace H with a let's say, and let's talk about function approximation here. So what you have on the right hand side, will it model the picture of the dog? I put it as one dog vector.
Okay.
So will it do it or not? This is function approximation. Okay, let's talk about the dog. It's picture in 2D. It's a function.
Yes.
Somehow I make a function out of it. And then I want to write it as beta 0 and will this be valid or not? What is the conversions?
So I am not sure I understood, because you substitute the data with dogs. Okay.
X mu
is a dog. Okay.
X mu is a dog.
But so you still have an hypothesis testing problem or not?
No.
So you just have those, okay.
Yes, but I want to write. So there is a function for the picture of right, and now I want to write as equal to. This is some function, okay? Equal to beta 0 m plus beta 1 g.
Okay.
Plus,
So you.
Is this valid or not?
So you want to find. Okay, maybe we can talk later because I'm not sure I understand. Okay. Okay, so this was the experiments, and this is the theory. But since I have time, I will do the actual theory, not just the shortcuts. So, okay, this is the theory actually. So we can analyze the model with analyze it mathematically with a perceptron. So we have a single neuron. The network will be basically a single neuron, and then we apply a nonlinearity sigma. And we train the network following the loss. That's just either if you test on your samples and +1 if you classify correctly, -1 if you classify not. And we probe the overlap of our neuron W with the easy spike or the hard spike. We don't have the spike in the mean because we simplify, we remove it. What happens is that we can derive our equations. That basically the important point is that in the loss we can take the expectations and rewrite it as a sum over coefficients. This is based on the Hermite expansion of this loss. And so it will have a form that's just a polynomial in the variables alpha u, alpha b. The point is that at the beginning of training, so when you initialize, you expect to don't have overlap with the inner direction. So you will have, on average, an overlap of order 1 over square root of d. This means that in all this series, with all these terms, we can just neglect most of the terms and just keep the leading order contributions, which are in this case, only these three terms. So we can keep only these three. And the critical part is that this term in red is absent if the latents are independent, and it's present only if there is a positive correlation. But this term here is exactly what drives learning. So I can then go back to the actual, yeah, okay. So here you see that the equations, if the latents are uncorrelated, you will have that the overlap on V grows as these equations. So alpha dot is equal alpha d to the cube, alpha b to the cube. And so if alpha b is very small, it will grow very, very slowly. And it's like, and we can take d to the cube samples, and it's like having a staircase that starts from an higher steps, and you cannot reach, and you get stuck, and you have a lot of time to climb. Instead, if you have latent star correlated, you have an additional term here that's depending on alpha u, but alpha u is the easy spike, so alpha u will learn fast, and it will boost the derivative to also learn alpha b. And so it's like kind of having additional steps starting from the zero, so that you will climb the staircase very fast. Okay, so basically this is what I wanted to tell. I will just summarize the key points. So we saw that neural network, the features that deep neural network learn are related to higher order correlations and these famous Gabor filters. Then we computed the theoretical baselines to learn from higher order correlations. So basically, we saw that you need quadratic number of samples, and then we found an algorithm that manages to do it with quadratic number of samples. And finally, we saw that if we change the data model and assume that it's possible that there is some low-order information in the data that transfer to high-order informations, then you can learn much faster. And this is all. I thank my collaborators. Yes.
There's questions.
You say that, I mean, what you expect is that the deep neural networks basically, I used to have pre-processing automatically some sample of pre-processing of
Exactly.
data, right? And this helps to say to solve the gap between the relation and the number of dimension, number of sample that usually doesn't is not enough.
Yes.
But these and these have to learn higher order explanations. But these did you try to test this example by taking
Devo spostarmi?
say a problem in which
Questa cazzo di gambe.
your input data are actually in a low dimension, close to a low dimensional space, or a full measure. For example, I don't know, I take a uniform measure on the sphere and I full a full the uniform measure on R2.
Okay.
Or
Vicino sempre di più, quello vedi tu.
because in this way you could see because if the network learn
Ci stanno filmando.
linearly,
or maybe it's the
Online.
maybe I heard some voice.
Okay, so because in this way, if you see that the network is actually able to learn in linear time, in linear say, complexity. But the case is that there is not really difference between the dimension. Otherwise, it's
No, wait. Can you describe again how you build the data? So you have like uniform everywhere, and then in a subspace.
Yeah, uniform is R3 as well.
Okay.
A full measure in R3. And a measure that is supported close to a low dimension.
Okay.
Space. Because it's clear that if you take the one that is full measure in R3, or you do PCA as example, you will get all the direction that as in, you should get like one as taking values.
Okay.
While if you do it for example locally for the sphere, you should get two eigenvalues and one that should be out of sphere.
Okay.
And there is actually two I would say dimensional reduction.
No, okay. I see your point. I mean, all the distribution that we saw here were full, like the support was everything.
Okay.
But still, if you spike the covariance, you still have some direction that are preferable. In all the cases that we tried, where you have like flat distribution, like it's not full dimension, then the network immediately goes to the subspace. Like that takes very little time. So in the second case, it improves a lot, the second case that you said, but even in the other case in which you have a full measure, but it still finds if the covariance is a little bit spiked.
And it's still able to detect high order correlation.
But not even I mean, even low order, like for example, in this case, this measure here is full measure because it's still, you still have the noise. I can use this. You still have the noise, but you also have the spikes in the covariance in the mean, so it will have different covariance and mean in those directions, and the network will immediately find it also. So it's really powerful in spotting low order correlation.
Okay, for low order, yes.
Okay.
It's for high order that.
So you mean?
Because I mean, it looks to me that the really difference between the really let's say thing that make powerful deep networks is able to learning the higher order correlation is able to reduce the gap between the central complexity, linear central complexity.
Exactly. Yeah, our hypothesis is that it really needs to depend on the data. So if the data was made that there is no possible, there is no flux like this, no flux from easy to hard, then the neural network cannot find it. It needs to already be there in the data. Because we proved that for our model, you cannot do better than quadratic central complexity. So for us, it's more a statement about the data, the real data, like properties of real data, more than ability of the network. So the network, of course, is then able to find it, but it's more kind of, we support evidence, we find evidence that supports that real data is done like this, with a flux from easy part to hard part. So if you build a model in which like higher order correlations, you really hide them well, no network will be able to find it. And that's also what we also show.
Okay.
So this is a probability measure, not your synthetic data, equations that you have.
It's both. It's synthetic data given by a probability measure. Yes.
The measure here then?
So the measure, you get it by adding this, because this is a Gaussian. This is a deterministic vector times a matter of that is value plus or minus 1. This is a deterministic vector times a Gaussian, and this is deterministic.
Okay.
So if you add everything, you will get something that's Gaussian, except from one direction, which is not Gaussian.
I see. So you have
It's
synthetic data.
synthetic data. Exactly. Yeah, it's like very simple synthetic data, because sometimes synthetic data you don't even have the density probability distribution. In this case, it's really simple data.
Yeah. This part is clear. I'll ask that question later.
Okay.
But can you go through with me the analysis part of it, because I got lost a little bit.
Yeah, sorry. It was very fast. Also, I didn't plan to do it, so I have everything in one slide, which is very bad. So to analyze this kind of models, you always have to start from your loss, which unfortunately I don't have the explicit formula here, but okay, we can maybe start from here. So this is our algorithm. This is gradient descent. We start from a random weight, and then the steps that we do is just we update it, taking the earlier weight, and then we add the gradient of the loss in some points, and then we normalize so that we have a norm one. Okay, and we keep doing this, but you see that this will depend on like the noise that at each point, at each time you take a random data point, and that random data point will have some noise, but will also have some signal. To differentiate to separate the two, we take the expectation of the loss. We basically will collect all the signal, and then the noise we capture late, like we take one term that's noise and we try to estimate that to say that the noise is small enough, the signal is large enough, and so we will be able to.
And then you look at the leading order now.
Exactly. And the point is that we are able to find estimate really well the signal and show that there is way more signal if there is this latent correlation, and there is way little signal if there is no latent correlation.
Okay, so in this argument where you said the noise is small, this is this is an assumption.
No, this is not an assumption. We start from the distribution that we wrote before.
Distribution,
Exactly. So under the hypothesis, we can prove that the noise is small. Is small if you have enough samples. So the noise will depend on how many samples you have, because the more samples you have, the less the noise. Okay.
Because I can give you another example where the variance is defined, for instance, like everyday distribution.
Yes.
Then it's
but yeah, everyday distribution for what? For the noise or for the signal?
Let's say because you have for the signal, and that's why you're taking the expectation, and that's why your noise
So if you have an everyday distribution for the signal, it will be amazing. We will learn very fast. But of course, for the signal, because it means you have a lot of signal. If you have an everyday distribution for the noise, then it's terrible. You will not learn anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing.
But I think for the noise, it's actually it's a good assumption that the noise is Gaussian, because also central limit theorem tells you that if you overlap a lot of different sources of noise that are independent, you will end up with a Gaussian noise. So the noise.
It's a central limit theorem as well. So where you can, it's exactly like the central limit theorem, where instead of a Gaussian, you end up in a alpha stable distribution. But the issue with the alpha distribution is that the variance.
Okay, but usually you apply standard central limit theorem because you have overlapping of different noise, so you will converge to a Gaussian. It's not Gaussian is actually the specific distribution, like particular distribution. Okay.
Understand that.
Okay, but we can talk more about the other question.
When it comes to real world applications, the question is you have that model. Is that valid for? Is it when you can go back?
Yes.
So
I think even if I didn't hear the answer, I would say no. So in general, it's not valid. Like this is a specific distribution, and under these assumptions, this works. But we don't claim that this holds in general. All that we claim is that real data must have something like this. Like real data will be way different, but there must be some flux of information between the easy part and the hard part. That's all we claim.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Correlations and everything.
Exactly, but we don't know the sample complexity for learning real data. We don't know exactly how complicated it will be. Like it's a huge challenge.
It looks to improve restrictive and
No, this is really restrictive. This is just an example. You can see it as an example. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Lorenzo again.
There is a comment.
No, there was a comment, but it was grazie mille.
Okay.
Okay, this was the last analysis junior seminar this year. I hope it will continue next year. So